Do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? And if not, what does that mean? Perhaps you've had someone who has taken it upon themselves to tell you what that means, and they've done it in a way that was possibly less than helpful. Maybe in a way that made you feel like that you were inadequate, or an infidel, or that maybe left you with these feelings of guilt and shame. And if that's your case, I want to apologize and say that I think that Christians can do a lot better job of representing the message of Easter and what it's all about. A few years ago, I was reading a book, and I came across a phrase that really spoke to me. It resonated with me, and it's pretty simple, but it kind of opened my eyes to look at things differently. And the statement said, "You can't believe what you can't believe." So what does that mean? If you've come here today to celebrate with friends and family, and you're not really sure what you believe, or you just don't feel like you can believe in this miracle of the resurrection of the dead, I find solace in this saying, you can't believe what you can't believe. Because instead of saying that someone is immoral, or that someone is an infidel, or that someone isn't a spiritual person, it simply indicates that you've processed information, and for one reason or another, you're simply not convinced. And if we're honest with ourselves, there's actually more of this kind of response on the first Easter than there was a response of faith. So if this morning you're unsure about this miracle that Christians claim, or you're really quite confident in your heart that this is all just a hoax, it's okay. This is a safe place for you to be with your questions. We want to apologize if Christians have misrepresented the message of Easter. And I think that you'll come to find, when we look at the story of Jesus' resurrection, that you might actually find yourself in good company. If we look at the gospel texts, Matthew, Luke, and John are the gospels that give us a narrative of what happens after Jesus' resurrection. In the Gospel of Matthew, it concludes with Jesus gathering with his 11 disciples, because at this point Judas has defected, so he's gathered with his 11 disciples in Galilee. And in Matthew chapter 28, he issues what is sometimes called the Great Commission, where Jesus looks at this motley crew and he says, "Therefore go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them all the things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the ages." And a lot of times Christians will kind of embrace this as a mission statement, like this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to go out of here and make disciples, and that's absolutely 100% true. But if we were to kind of go back and look at the context a little bit to see the verse right before that, we read that when the disciples saw him, when they saw Jesus, some of them worshiped him, but some doubted. We tend to leave that part out on Easter Sunday. That some of the disciples who had followed Jesus throughout his earthly ministry, they had gathered there, and I can't really explain what they thought was happening if they didn't think that they saw the resurrected Jesus, but apparently they were conflicted in some way. Some of them worshiped him, some of them doubted. And Jesus looked at those who doubted and said, "Get out of here," right? No. He looked at all of them, regardless of whether they worshiped him or whether they doubted, and he said, therefore go to all nations and make disciples. He looked at people who had deep faith and people who had deep doubt, and he said, I need all of you. I need all of you. Because you're all going to tell different stories of your experience to help people relate to what God is doing in the world. Jesus sent out doubters to spread the good news, to begin the life of the church. If we move to the Gospel of Luke, which is the text that we read this morning, we discover, which is in every gospel, all four gospels, that those who come to the tomb early in the morning are women. So thank you, ladies, for setting a good example. They come to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, and when they get there, they discover that the stone has been rolled away, that the tomb is empty. And of course, we've had 2,000 years to process this, interpret this, get used to it so that it's not quite so exciting. But if we imagine it in that moment, they are not thinking that Jesus has risen from the dead. They are thinking that there's been some kind of a grave robber, that there's been some kind of obstruction here. They're terrified, and then there's this announcement that Christ is risen. Just as he told you. This isn't quite a I told you so, but it's pretty close. He is risen just as he told you. And so the women run. These are the female disciples of Jesus. The word disciple simply means student. And so they are the female students of Jesus. They run to the male students of Jesus, and they say, listen, this is what's happened. The stone is rolled away. The tomb is empty. There are these angelic messengers who have said that he is risen just as he told you. Like he kind of prepared you for this. Yes, it's really shocking, but at the same time, like there was a plan. And what does the gospel tell us? That the disciples were so excited and they were like, man, I wish that we had gone to the tomb early with the women so we hadn't missed out on this. No. 10 out of 11 rolled back over and went back to sleep. Okay? So if you're watching on live stream this morning, you thought about coming to church and you rolled over and you went back to sleep. It's okay, you're in good company. The earliest disciples did that as well. But there was this one, his name was Simon Peter, and he ran to the tomb. And I got to back up for a second. What was their response? Not only did they roll over and go back to sleep, but they thought that it was an idle tale. They didn't believe. Followers of Jesus who had witnessed him do miraculous things, they did not believe. They went back to sleep. And then it's kind of weird because it says Simon goes to the tomb, he looks in, it's empty, and then he goes home. That's got to be kind of an embarrassing way for your story to be told, right? To be told for thousands of years. But the earliest disciples of Jesus, when they first heard about this idea of resurrection, they didn't believe either, because even though we look back and we think that people in antiquity had a more primitive perspective on life and biology and science and all of those things, believe it or not, they still didn't believe that dead people came back to life. And so the disciples, they weren't expecting this to happen. They were in disbelief. And then we come to the Gospel of John, which is a really important story because it tells us specifically about this one disciple. His name is Thomas, and he usually gets a really bad rap. He's usually called Doubting Thomas. Now, if you've ever heard the story about Doubting Thomas and you've thought, hey, I'm never going to talk to anybody about what I believe or don't believe because they're going to step on my toes. Well, there's something that we need to know about Thomas. If we look at the original language in the New Testament, it's not actually saying that he doubted. If you're familiar with the alpha prefix and how it goes in front of a word and it negates a word, well, actually what's happening here in the New Testament is it's using the word faith with the alpha prefix. And so if you're not following me up to this point, it simply means he didn't believe. He lacked faith. It doesn't mean that he doubted, because there's something that's different between doubt and disbelief. Doubt is kind of this gray area where there's a sense of openness and curiosity, and also maybe a little bit of critique. Sometimes we think of doubt as the opposite of faith. But a few years ago, I heard something, and it's something that I've kind of wrestled with. Maybe the opposite of faith isn't doubt. Maybe the opposite of doubt is certainty. After all, faith isn't certainty. It's about believing. It's about trusting. The story of Thomas isn't about somebody who had doubts. It was about somebody who simply could not believe, and for good reasons, because dead people don't come back to life. Thomas wanted some empirical evidence, and so Jesus gives him that. Jesus appears to Thomas, and he says, "Now you believe, but blessed are those who believe, who haven't seen." If you've ever been made to feel bad because you don't believe in an extraordinary claim, it's okay. Because the disciples did not believe in this extraordinary claim initially either. Instead, they started out as doubters, people who had to kind of work through what had happened. They had to process it, they had to sit with it, and they began to claim encounters with the living Christ. Now, I want to be clear with you this morning that I believe in the resurrection of Jesus. I believe that on Easter Sunday morning, the stone was rolled away because God moved it back, because Jesus walked out through the transformation that resurrection brings, and that new creation was initiated. I believe that. I like to think that I'm a critical thinker and that I don't just believe everything that I hear. I think that there's actually some credibility, even though the New Testament doesn't portray itself as a hard and fast kind of historical document. There is some historical evidence there to support this event. So there is some evidence here that I want to look at. The first is that the tomb is empty. And there are some plausible explanations for how that may have happened, but the tomb was empty that Sunday morning. The tomb is empty today. This is not what the disciples were expecting. They were shocked. They were surprised at what had happened. In addition to that, there's something that scholars call the criteria of embarrassment. And what that means is that if early Christians were trying to just create a new religion, trying to create a new religion from scratch, a new movement, then they used kind of a poor strategy. Because in antiquity, a woman's testimony would not have been accepted. In fact, in Jewish law, it required 2 or more witnesses, and none of those witnesses could be a woman. So when the Gospels tell us that the first people to announce the good news of Jesus' resurrection, that the tomb is empty, that Christ is alive, when the Gospels portray the women as being the first messengers, in their world, in their context, they're already hurting their credibility by telling the story according to the way that it happened. Another kind of thing that falls within this criteria of embarrassment is the fact that the male disciples of Jesus who carried on the tradition of this story and passed it along and it ended up in Scripture, they didn't paint themselves in a very positive light, right? They rolled over and went back to sleep. And if they wanted to make themselves look a little bit better, they had the power and the influence to do that. They could have said that none of them doubted and all of them worshiped, but they were willing to convey the story as they experienced it and as they remembered it, even if it didn't always put them in a positive light. There's also a passage that I read from as we began our service this morning, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It is the most definitive passage in the entire Bible about the death and resurrection of Jesus and the implications for our lives. And in it, we hear the earliest tradition of Jesus' resurrection. It actually predates all four Gospels. And it tells us the people that Jesus specifically appeared to: Cephas, which is the Aramaic name for Peter, and to James, who is the brother of Jesus. And it's important to remember that because during Jesus' life and ministry, his brother James didn't believe him. And then after Jesus' death, James kind of does this 180 about face and starts to follow the Christ, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless something happened. And Paul claims in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that there was a time before Jesus ascended into heaven that 500 people encountered and witnessed the resurrected Christ at once. And if Paul is making this up, then someone could have easily called him out on it, like, where were those 500 people? Who are they? Maybe they were all delusional, but when was the last time there were 500 people who shared the same delusion? And of course, we have Paul himself, who encountered the resurrected Christ, and his life was changed. And I think that's probably the greatest evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, is that it's not just a historical event, but it's something that we can encounter, and our lives are changed. There's actually a story about this following the text that Mary read in the Gospel of Luke. As Jesus has risen, the women have gone back to tell the disciples that he's risen. We're told about these two other disciples who travel on the road to Emmaus, and they're talking about all the things that have happened over the last couple of days and how discouraged and defeated they feel because Jesus, who everyone had claimed was the Messiah, he had been crucified. And so all of their hopes of liberation and freedom were just completely dashed. And so they're walking along and they're kind of bearing their souls to one another. And along comes this stranger. And he walks with them and he talks with them on their journey. He listens to them process what they've experienced and heard. And then we're told that as they come to their house, that the stranger goes in with them and he breaks bread with them, and that their eyes are open and they recognize that it's Jesus, that he's been raised from the dead. Their hearts are strangely warmed. Their lives are filled with that hope and that peace again. Now, I am going to be honest with you all this morning. I am a born skeptic. In fact, I have joked around that sometimes I believe that God called me into ministry to keep me on a short leash. And there have been times in my journey that I have struggled with the claims of Christianity. There have been times where I have struggled to the point that I thought I had no other choice but to walk away. And the only reason that I'm standing here today to proclaim the good news and the hope of the resurrection is not because somewhere along the way I read another article and found some information that was more persuasive and changed my mind. I'm standing here today because on my journey, a stranger was always with me and never let me go very far. The resurrected Christ met me where I was and brought me life and hope again. And that's the good news of Easter, is that it's not just about some historical event that took place 2,000 years ago, even though we as Christians can affirm that, but it's about the fact that Christ is risen. Not was risen, but Christ is risen. He lives among us. And every time we break bread and every time that we gather together, the living Christ is with us. He joins us on the journey of life. I want to kind of wrap things up this morning with the questions that I started with. Do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? If not, what does that mean? What if you find the story of Jesus really beautiful and compelling, and you've processed all of this information, but you remain unconvinced? What does that mean? You might be surprised to know that you're actually better poised to be a follower of Jesus than you ever imagined. If we remember the earliest disciples and the fact that they wrestled with their doubts and their disbeliefs. If we look at the Gospels and the way that Jesus ministered and the way that Jesus called his disciples, we'll see that he never approached anyone and just said, "Believe in me." It always began with, "Follow me." It began with, "Follow me." And as the disciples followed Jesus, as they witnessed him and as they heard him preach and as they saw him performing miraculous deeds, they started to believe in him. And so if you find yourself in a place where you find the story of Easter compelling and beautiful, but you're not quite convinced, and you admire Jesus and you want to be like him because he was just an incredibly wonderful person, then I want to encourage you, even if you can't believe, just try following him. Just try to become like him. I want to encourage you to read the Gospels, to read the stories about his compassion and his love, his fierce sense of justice, his advocacy for those who lived on the margins. And when you do that, you might encounter the living Christ. I want to encourage you to get plugged into a community of faith. A church where it is safe to doubt, where it's safe to wrestle with your questions. And if you don't have a place to worship, this church is a safe place to bring your doubts, to bring your questions as you seek to follow Jesus. And as you come together with a group of other people who are flawed and asking questions on this journey, you might experience the resurrected Christ. Finally, I want to encourage you to share your time and your resources to serve others who are in need. For those who are hungry, for those who are struggling because they've experienced some kind of natural disaster or personal life experience, insert yourself into their lives. Be there to serve. Give of yourself and do the kind of things that Jesus did. And when you do those things, regardless of whether you're wrestling with doubts or not, when you least expect it, you might witness a stranger who's been journeying with you all along. Perhaps your eyes will be opened and you'll see the resurrected Christ. Christ is risen.